Hey, well, we're exactly at noon, so I think I'll go ahead and get started because I'm very excited to get to our speakers and to our Q&A today. So first of all, my name is Victoria Wolcott. I am director of the Gender Institute here at the University at Buffalo, and a professor of history. And before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home of the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Welcome to everybody who's joining us today, particularly those who are not here in Buffalo. Really glad that you could attend this event today. Big thank you to the Gender Institute staff, Sarabi Pant and Megan Vaughn, for all they have done to help make today's event possible and to run smoothly. And before I introduce today's speakers, I want to quickly alert you to our next event because I think there's going to be a number of folks who are interested in this next event who are attending this event. So this is March 27th at noon, and it's part of our Feminist Research Alliance talks, which are basically works in progress that we offer here at UB. And this is also an online event. So Kevin Lee, who's a new faculty member in Indigenous Studies here at UB, and Josh Campbell, who's a political scientist at UCLA, will speak about their collaborative project on Indigenous political theorists in the Pacific, centering on questions of space, place, indigeneity, and the cultural and intellectual manifestations of colonialism. So please join us for that. Again, that's March 27th at noon, and you can register. It's in the link is in the chat there. So I also, before introducing the speakers, I just want to say very briefly that in our current political climate, I really find nothing more sustaining or more conducive to us building resilience than offering a platform for scholars of race, gender, and sexuality to share their work. The Gender Institute's New Books and New Feminist Direction series was created by my predecessor, Carrie Brayman, for just this purpose, and it now has even more weight, I think, than it ever has. So with that in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speakers, which I'll do briefly. I could go on forever about them, but I'll try to be brief, and then I'll turn the platform over to them. First of all, we're really happy to welcome Charlene Carruthers, who is a writer, filmmaker, and community organizer, and Black Studies PhD candidate at Northwestern University. She is a practitioner of telling more complete stories, and her work interrogates historical conjectures of Black freedom-making, post-emancipation, and decolonial revolution, Black governance, Black Native and Indigenous relationalities, and Black feminist abolitionist geographies. She served as the founding national director of the Black Youth Project 100 and is the author of the best-selling book, Unapologetic, A Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. And Mark Rifkin, who is our celebrated author, who we're here to discuss his most recent publication, is professor of global gender and sexuality studies here at UB. He is the author of many books, 8 in total, including Beyond Settler Time, The Temporal Sovereignty and Indigenous Self-Determination, and When Did Indians Become Straight? Kinship, The History of Sexuality, and Native Sovereignty, and many more as well. His work has won national awards, such as the John Hope Franklin Prize for Best Book in American Studies, and he has served as president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Mark is here today to discuss his most recent book, published by Duke University Press, The Politics of Kinship, Race, Family, and Governance. So I'm going to turn things over to Mark first, who's going to talk a little bit about this book, and then Charlene will have a conversation with Mark. So Mark, take it away.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you to the staff of the Gender Institute. Thank you so much, Charlene, for agreeing to come chat with me about this book, especially because your work has been so important in my thinking in this book. And thank you to everyone who's here. So I'm going to read a bit from the introduction of the book, and then I'll read a little bit from the coda and then talk a bit about the chapters. So beginning at the beginning. Child stealing has been a historical staple of racialization in the United States. And perhaps the most spectacularly egregious example of this pattern in recent memory, the Trump administration adopted the policy, often denied as such, but still enforced, of rending migrant families at the border, leading to the detention of at least 4,500 children over a 3-year period and possibly thousands more. This horrifying, unspeakably cruel, and deeply traumatizing denial of migrant humanity, though, came into view as part of mass-mediated discourse in ways other routine modes of institutionalized child stealing do not. Every year, Black and Indigenous children are taken into government custody, separated from their parents by the state at rates that are respectively approaching 2 and over 3 times their presence in the US population. These numbers represent almost 6,000 Native children and over 53,000 African American children annually. Such state intervention may appear as, in Elizabeth Povinelli's terms, a quasi-event, one that does not appear as a crisis per se, while being part of an extended state-sanctioned project of wearing down racialized populations. It illustrates a sustained set of dynamics in which the government's terrifying and sickening actions on the border can be seen less as exception than as a particularly concentrated example of the status quo of how whiteness operates through structural violence. In understanding these patterns, commentators often have emphasized the horror of dividing families on the basis of race. Justice then lies in refusing to use racist distinctions, demeanings, and discriminations such that families can remain intact. Appeals to the affective units and densities of feeling associated with family aim to endow a sense of shared humanness that can serve as a basis for repudiating institutionalized racial distinctions. Yet in doing so, a range of structuring assumptions about what constitutes personhood, privacy, and political authority are employed that de facto can normalize the racializing dynamics of liberal governance. What if the issue lies less in the non-recognition of family than forced incorporation into the category of family? What if such inclusion helps drive the very ideological and institutional processes of race-making that result in diminished possibilities and life chances for those belonging to populations constituted as non-white? What if the family serves as a principal vehicle through which to draw the line between those who count as persons and those who don't, not because they can't access the rights of family, but because they are subject to this category through which the racializing construction of non-personhood occurs? A naturalized vision of what might be called kinship acts as an ostensibly neutral frame of reference that effaces not only the politics of how kinship is defined and deployed, i.e., who is included and excluded, but also the ways kinship itself serves as an ideological matrix through which the content, contours, and character of politics is constituted. If we think of kinship less as a means of remediating racialization than as a discursive and institutional mode through which processes of racialization are reproduced and regulated, anti-racist and anti-colonial intellectual work might turn away from affirming the capacity of people of color to be what we might describe as enfamilied, and turn toward an analysis of how family or kinship serves as a mechanism for producing depoliticizing narratives of ingrained deviancy around which racial population making takes shape. Since the late 19th century, the concept of kinship largely has functioned as a way of translating non-liberal social formations into the categories, differences, and scale structures of liberalism. Kinship allows social units and networks that do not fit liberal mappings of the public-private distinction and that exceed the nuclear family unit to be cast as excessive, backward, and/or socially dysfunctional versions of liberal home and family, albeit ones that do not seem to know their proper place and character. The specific contours and content of such supposed failures have served as ways of delineating and typifying kinds of racialized persons, of constituting racialized populations. Particular racial groups appear as such in being targeted for state intervention and management due to their ostensibly characteristic inabilities to live out liberal forms of privacy, intimacy, and care, as those dynamics categorically are contradistinguished from the work of governance. What would happen, though, if we were to understand the very forms cast as racialized aberrants due to their supposed failure to enact liberal norms of enfamiliament as instead political orders? What might such an act of redescription make possible? The construction of racial non-personhood through presenting non-white populations as constitutively incapable of performing proper forms of family and homemaking is less an expression of the secure dominance of liberal governance than its anxieties, contingencies, and instabilities in the face of what might be characterized as alternative political orders. In The State is a Man, Audra Simpson addresses the ways that the murder of Indigenous women on lands claimed by Canada and the United States can be understood as part of a broader assault on Indigenous governance. She observes, quote, "An Indian woman's body in settler regimes such as the US and in Canada is loaded with meaning, signifying other political orders, land itself, of the dangerous possibility of reproducing Indian life, and most dangerously, other political orders," end quote. When Simpson speaks of other political orders, more than referring to the jurisdiction of Indigenous polities over their territories, unbound from settler legal and administrative oversight, she is invoking other conceptions of what constitutes the shape and stuff of governance, such that the gendered, heteronormative, and privatizing frameworks at play in the liberal state do not provide the paradigm for governance in terms of its modes of operation, its normative principles, or its scalar structure. Leanne Simpson, no relation to Audra Simpson, further develops the notion that Indigenous bodies signify or point toward the existence of other political orders, into the idea that Indigenous bodies are such political orders. She argues that, quote, Indigenous bodies, particularly the bodies of Two-Spirit and queer people, children, and women, represented the lived alternative to heteronormative constructions of gender, political systems, and rules of descent. They are political orders, end quote. Later adding that, quote, within Nishnabeg thought, every body is a political order and every body houses individual self-determination, end quote. This reframing radically reimagines political scale by understanding intimate life and everyday connections as immanently bearing within them the structuring dynamics of governance, as shaping collective processes of decision-making, resource distribution, placemaking, belonging, etc., that are the substance of self-determination in both an individual and a political sense. While these analyses speak specifically to Indigenous peoplehood and modes of life, the conception of political order that they articulate might serve as a means of thinking about the kinds of collective practices that become racialized as expressions of failed or aberrant kinship. More than solely pointing to the failure of the settler state fully to acknowledge the sovereignty of native governments, the attention to Indigenous political orders seeks to open up possibilities for expanding the kinds of processes, networks, regularities of practice, and webs of interdependence that can be seen as governance. The ideologies of enfamilment that historically have been central to liberal governance and that remain so cannot accommodate these formations as politics. Or rather, liberal governance may be said to depend on recoding such politics as kinship, as properly belonging to a private sphere in which such forms appear as racialized deviance. While articulated within Native studies as a means of characterizing Indigenous peoplehood, the notion of political orders might be drawn on as a way of rethinking, of redescribing the dynamics of racialization in the United States and more broadly. A familiar strategy within Native intellectual and political discourses is to insist that Indigenous peoples are political orders rather than the population constructed through racialized figurations of Indianness. Doing so seeks to leverage the ways racialization recasts Native polities as collections of non-white persons who can then be treated as domestic subjects of the settler state's jurisdiction, rather than as their own autonomous, self-determining political entities with rightful governance over their lands and waters. However, if that insistence often serves as a way of separating politics from race as a definitional frame for understanding Native peoplehood, the imbrication to which that very confusion points can operate as a lens through which to characterize the ideological work of racialization itself. To cast modes of governance as instead a function of racial genealogy not only denies that these matrices of collective self-ordering can count as a politics, but presents them as a function of racial inclinations, as expressive of a pathologically deformed private sphere, as emanating from aberrant, excessive, and disordered kinds of kinship and homemaking. In this way, forms of governance that do not fit liberal frameworks historically get presented as evidence of privatized racial incapacity, as symptomatic of an ingrained inability to be a proper subject. This dynamic, though, might be seen not only as pertaining to Indigenous peoples, but also at play with regard to kinds of racialization enacted within the US settler state, to other kinds of racialization enacted within the US settler state, recognizing that the contours of those racializations may differ, as well as the kinds of political orders to which they point. More than defining groups as outside and family personhood, the dynamics of racialization recode patterns of collective life that do not fit liberal geographies and scalar dynamics, as if they were immanent tendencies that testify to inherent racial difference. And skipping to the coda. Moreover, the significance of such political orders does not lie in their capacity to be scaled up. Given the importance of the state in the distribution of resources, regulation of life chances, and claimed monopoly over legitimate violence, including murder by the police and incarceration, the state can help generate a romance or tragedy of scale in which the only way to alter existing circumstances seems to be to create mass mobilizations that can influence state institutions, or in which the absence of such mobilization means the unchanging continuance of an exhausting, immiserating, and wounding status quo. Such mobilization can make a difference in lived circumstances and possibilities, and the state does serve as an unavoidable terrain of struggle in the present. Yet such an investment in or identification with scale can overlook or underemphasize the socialities in which other ways of living are incubated, sustained, and proliferated. Those projects of collective world-making, call them political orders, may not be scalable. Further, desire for that scalability may replicate the infrastructural imaginary of the state. Alternative political orders exist alongside the state, even as the latter racializes, assaults, and seeks to contain and dismantle them. That besideness challenges the obviousness and legitimacy of state frames without seeking to become the state or a new state, and without those other modes of governance necessarily articulating themselves in an antagonistic relation to the state, even as their forms contest the assumptions at play in liberal ideologies. To see these forms as governance, though, refuses the ways they have been privatized as racial deviance, as expressions of wrong home and family that testify to the existence of a backward, criminal, degenerate population that needs to be managed and from whom the general public of properly and familied citizen subjects needs protection. Looking for the presence of such political orders widens the capacity to envision governance otherwise, while also suspending the scalar imperatives that continue to make the liberal state seem like the only option around. And just to say a little bit about the chapters, so the first chapter thinks about the history of anthropology and the development of the concept of kinship within that history and what that means, and the ways certain patterns of conceptualizing kinship seem to have extended into contemporary queer studies. And then on the other hand, thinking about the way that Indigenous studies has thought kinship outside of the liberal private sphere and kinship as a mode of governance. The second chapter thinks about Indian policy, contemporary Indian policy, and especially the ways that race and notions of racial Indianness operate as part of the structure of contemporary Indian law and policy in decisions and legislation that seem both anti and for Indigenous sovereignty. So that racialization is a structuring part of how various aspects of Indian policy work in the present. And that chapter 2, also thinks about contemporary Indigenous feminist thinkings about political identity and governance that move away from racial notions of Indianness and the Indian family. Chapter 3 thinks about the legal history of privacy and marriage across US history, and thinking about, in various instances, what those determinations around privacy and marriage have to do with the thinking about state sovereignty and the ways that discourses of race have shaped what can count as governance and what counts as criminal in relation to state sovereignty. And then the final chapter thinks about blackness and criminality across US history, using several different case studies as a way of thinking about how Black efforts to create forms of collective self-determination, collective self-ordering, call them political orders, how Black efforts to do so have been criminalized by the state, and specifically through the representation of Black people as lacking proper home and family, and this as a reason for state intervention to break up those forms of collective world making, to break up those political orders.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so I'll have to be very transparent and say that all the questions I ask will be self-interested. And largely because my own research, I'm looking at Black placemaking, Black and Indigenous relationalities here, and using the language you've used on lands claimed by the United States, and also in Liberia, and very particularly in lands claimed by the United States today, thinking about the all-Black town of Boley, Oklahoma, which was founded in Indian territory. And so I'm thinking about these places, looking at these places geographically, historically, and through literature. And as I read through your text, which I'm, of course, still working through, it is quite extensive that I'm still working through, and find deeply relevant for my own work, where I'd love to start in talking about our, not just, because I'm going to get to some of the major theoretical offerings that you make in the text, but I'm really curious about the process as well. I don't think we oftentimes get space to talk about process. How did you come about this project? You've written so many books. Why this book? Why is it important? Why was it important for you to take up this project? Yeah, let's just start there.
So there are a number of different strands that come in. So I will try to rein in this potential answer, and we'll see how successful I am. So in 2011, I published a book called When Did Indians Become Straight? Kinship, the History of Sexuality and Native Sovereignty. And part of what I argue in that book is that one of the principal ways that US settler colonialism has worked against Native peoples is through inserting them into heteronormative ideas of home and family. Because then through that process, Native modes of governance get treated as wrong home and family, as a uncivilized lack of awareness about what home and family is. So that then the breaking up of Native landholding, Native forms of governance, of Native social organization, that breaking up is presented as kind of tutelage, right? As teaching Native people how to be civilized. So that then kinship as a concept, I talk about the sort of anthropological history of this of translating Native social forms and governance into liberal terms as sort of wrong, home, and family, right? That work then also is thinking about the ways that the racialization of Native people as Indians, right? The understanding of a transmission of racial bloodedness that comes through a heteronormative notion of family. You get blood from your mother and blood from your father, and that equals your blood, right? That way of framing Native identity as Indianness was part of this heteronormative imposition onto Native peoples. And so thinking about the difference between that racialization of Native peoples as Indians versus, right, a recognition of Native governance, right? And the ways that Native social forms that did not look like the nuclear family, that did not look like liberal government with its separation of the public and the private, right, then come to be viewed as forms of racial backwardness, right? Okay, so there's all of that, which is certainly part of this project. But then since then, I've also been thinking a lot about increasingly the role of race, right, in this management of Indigenous sovereignty, how the US government's efforts to think about Native peoples as a racial population works as a kind of internal limit to what will be recognized as sovereignty or Native governance by the US, right? And also increasingly thinking about the relationship between Indigenous studies and Black studies, and the different, and so in 2019, I published a book called Fictions of Land and Flesh, Blackness, Indigeneity, Speculation. And it was attempting to think about how formulations around land and formulations around flesh and fungibility can be kind of at odds with each other and can in some ways talk past each other, and trying to think about how that works and how to respond to that. But part of that, thinking about that book, was also the ways that the question of how to think about forms of Black placemaking, right? How to think about processes of Black collective self-determination and governance on specific lands, right? I wasn't thinking specifically about Black towns at that point, but like Black towns, right? I was thinking about marronage, right? And the ways that marronage, the effort by individuals and communities to escape from enslavement and to settle elsewhere, right? How marronage often gets talked about in terms of flight, stealing yourself, fugitivity, but tends not to be talked about in terms of collective placemaking, right? And so wanting to think about that, and that as a potential bridge between Indigenous and Black studies. And then thinking about, I've been drawing increasingly on the notion of political orders, which emerges in Audra Simpson's work, and then Leanne Simpson particularly takes it up in her book, As We Have Always Done, and thinking about the ways that that notion of political orders, and where Leanne Simpson talks about bodies as political orders, the way that refigures what governance is, right? Governance is an everyday dynamic. It's made and remade through interpersonal interactions. The private sphere is not sort of separated from the site of governance. And this becomes a way of challenging forms of heteronormativity, becomes a way of challenging the dismissal of Native women, right, from the political scene, right? And so, but I was increasingly thinking about then, if political orders becomes a way of rethinking what constitutes governance, might that be a way of thinking about Black collective placemaking? Might that be a way of thinking about other kinds of collectivity and efforts of community self-organization, right? And then also, the other sort of line into this is that increasingly within Native studies, folks like Glenn Coulthard and Rob Nichols have been rethinking the Marxist category of primitive accumulation, right? And primitive accumulation in Marxism is that stage where if land is available for a range of uses, right, and common people can access it for a range of uses for subsistence and et cetera, right, then in order to get to capitalism, that land needs to be privatized. It needs to no longer be accessible, right? And then the people who could access land before don't have access to those resources. Now they need to become workers, right? And now they need wage work in order to buy what they could have accessed on the land previously. this is what primitive accumulation is. So with Indigenous studies, thinking about that not as a stage in capitalism, but instead as an ongoing process through which Indigenous lands are seen as extractable, right, for the settler state, and in which Indigenous modes of life and governance, right, are constantly being translated into the capitalist colonialist terms of the settler state. So I increasingly sort of connecting a lot of these was thinking about then race, racialization, the translation of Indigenous peoples as that racial population that is Indians as a mode of primitive accumulation, as a way of trying to break up Native social forms in order to access Native land, in order to subject Indigenous peoples to settler governance. But then, of course, Indianizing is not the only form of racialization on lands claimed by the US. So in thinking about how might racialization, that creation of populations and understanding of them as inferior or needing supervision or needing intervention or criminal, how might that function as a way of breaking up political orders? How might that way function as a way of treating collective forms of life and placemaking and decision making by various communities of color, treating those forms of world making as expressive of racial backwardness, criminality, not, antisocial inability to have home and family. So then that's part of how then race, political orders kind of come together in a way that is a significant rethinking of my previous work. And when did Indians become straight? And the sort of nowness of it, or why now, I think was about relationships between Indigenous and Black studies, political connections between Indigenous, Black folks, migrants, right, et cetera. And then also the kind of horrors of Trump administration #1, right? Which of course we're in now. And then thinking about the state and the problem of the state and the problem of scale, and thinking about my own feeling dwarfed by the scale of what's happening. And what does it mean to feel dwarfed by scale, right? Because it seems so beyond me. I can't affect it. I can't, and so what does it mean to think other kinds of politics? What does it mean to think political possibilities that don't require jumping from the me to the federal kind of space as a way of imagining really a future, right, and hope?
I was really drawn to the conversations about scale because it's
Mhm.
a matter or an issue that comes up often, at least in the spaces that I'm in community organizing spaces or political strategy spaces. It's like we have to scale up. They're very concretely, we have sat down. I have been in meetings where we take the number of Black people, at least known, categorized in the United States through the census is like, say, 40 million people. We need to reach 10% in order to move, like to really be at a scale. Just throwing out some numbers here, but this is literally how we talk and how we've discussed things. But what you're offering here, I underline this part in the coda, and you read a little bit. I don't think you read this particular line, but if you did, even if you did, I'll repeat it because I underlined it. You say that I believe, excuse me, you say, this is on page 258, if the actually existing state cannot be ignored due to its concentration of power and potential, largely to harm, it also cannot be the horizon for envisioning governance or for understanding how governance has been lived by racialized people or peoples. And to me, it's actually a different challenge. It poses a different challenge or a different possibility for the reach that we must go after in our respective organizing strategies. And I think it also is suggesting a way to theorize as well, and not just on the hyper individualistic level. I don't believe in taking our individual stories and then making up whole theories around it, just because we have this single experience. But I think what you're offering us is to even think like in our theorizing, it may not be like, how do we make an entire new world? But literally, how do we recognize that there are many worlds? that many people are living within, that many people are contending with in different ways, and how might we move at that scale of the many as opposed to this one big
Mhm.
thing, and
Mhm.
refusing even like the allure of what the state tells us, and even liberalism, what it tells us how we need to move. But I'm interested. I mean, there's so many things, and we only have like 25 more minutes that I want to
Mhm.
talk more about. Is you also, and you began to talk about it a little bit just now, in talking about the bridging between Native studies and Black studies. And I think a number of things are named in here that I think need to be named more often, or I've been afraid to name or say, or actually I need to quote somebody else in saying the thing. Like, for example, when I think it was Leanne Simpson, maybe, who said this was also in the coda, where you
Mhm.
talk about, um, I underlined a lot of things. It might be in the coda, or it might be in chapter 4. Um, but since I can find the piece in here in the introduction, where you talk specifically about this taking up of indigenous formulations to think native and racialized non-native modes of collective life seems particularly pressing in light of both the tendency within indigenous studies, often implicitly, to circulate a narrative of indigenous exceptionality as not defined by race, as other than national minorities, which can be diminishing of other social struggles, and the tendency in other areas of critical ethnic studies and progressive/broadly leftist scholarship to treat indigenous intellectual frames as parochial and thus largely irrelevant for thinking about anything not specifically focused on Native peoples. So I'm curious about, I'd love to hear, I have my thoughts,
Mhm.
but I'd love to hear more on your thoughts about like what this particular text, and perhaps we could start with a particular text, what it is doing to current, and even potentially what it could do for future discourse across and within Native studies and Black studies.
So to go back to the issue of scale, though, I think that to address that, before then the most immediate question that you asked, um, as I sort of see throughout, okay, like we can't just pretend the state isn't there. We can't just, I mean, like especially this moment, like we cannot pretend the state is there. But but it's also then what this moment suggests is the problem of having the state, right, as our principal way of thinking about what governance can look like, what our own collective processes for making decisions. I mean, this is something that you talk about in Unapologetic, which I cite a number of times here, that governance is, right, folks figuring out, right, how they want to be with each other in the world, right? Making decisions together around that, right? And so I think that the part of what scale does, what that sense of like it's the country, we need to fight for the state, right, of the country. I think what that sense of scale can do is it imagines that, well, if we can just capture those institutions, right? We just need to have enough people in Congress. We just need to get this piece of legislation passed. We just need this Supreme Court decision. If we have that, then we're going to be good, right? As opposed to the question of how both people are building individually, but then also collectively infrastructures for their own lives, right?
Mhm.
How are they building the forms that are going to support them and enable them, right, to live individually and with other people and to build right together? But also that even that large scale stuff, I think, requires the building of those infrastructures. And to the extent that people are or have been are organizing those collective forms in their everyday life, right?
Mhm.
That becomes a powerful basis, right, for imagining what scaled up things look like or can look like, or at least what provide the infrastructure for those skills, rather than it just being about getting to that institution, getting to right, that scale in a way that imagines the everyday as just this either relevant or kind of this way station on the way to the real politics, as opposed to
Which
the everyday as the real basis for building a world.
Which I think differs from prefigurative politics, which is also something that is kind of popular, not just popular, but prevalent in contemporary social movements. And the reason I bring it up is because you are pointing us towards what is right now.
Mhm.
What is right now, and not just about let's develop a campaign or a project that and what I mean by prefigurative politics, a campaign or a project, or even a community that is an example of how we want the world to be. That gives us a real life like this. We're going to prefigure, we're going to create before the thing exists out in the world, the thing right now, the practice right now, which I think there's a lot that warrant, like I've engaged in, I do it. But what becomes possible when we look at the things that exist right now and find
And
value
have
and have
and
happened
have
and have
right.
happened. That's right. That's
Right,
right.
and
And
I think that the sense of like there's a lot of discussion currently, right, around especially for variously marginalized, minoritized folks, right? You know, like our ancestors survived worse, right? Our ancestors survived, so in this moment it's possible. But also think about like what people in what recently emancipated folks, right? In the recently Confederate South actually set up, right?
yeah,
And that was targeted by the state. It was attempted to be dismantled by the state. But that sense, that possibility for self-organizing, or as I talk about also, this is in chapter 4, as I also talk about in chapter 4, thinking about the forms of social life and sharing and decision making, which has often been referred to as kinship, that was occurring in like northern inner cities, right, in the 60s and 70s, under incredibly brutal conditions of segregation and I was going to say de facto segregation, but the fact that it wasn't legal as segregation did not mean that the state wasn't continuing to produce it in
that's right.
deeply extractive ways, right? But even in those circumstances, people are creating modes of living, right?
That's right.
And the extent to which any of those forms we want to see as models for the future, open question, but people have been doing it, right?
That's
And
right.
it's the doing of it, which I think is crucial. And I think that, and this gets to your the previous question, right? Native studies and Black studies, thinking about the relationship between them, that I see work happening in Black studies, right? Like Danielle Purifoy's work on Black towns, right, in the South, or Jovan Scott Lewis, right, who I also cite in Politics of Kinship, his work on Greenwood and North Tulsa, or Elena Roberts, right, work also on Black town making, right, in largely in Oklahoma, right, that there's work happening in Black studies on forms of Black collective placemaking, right? Sometimes under the sign of sovereignty, I mean, the critical sign of sovereignty, the scholar using that term, right?
Right.
Sometimes not, right? But it seems that this is a vital point of connection between Native studies and Black studies, especially given that one of the critical tendencies is to, I think this is maybe abating a bit, but I'm not entirely sure, of characterizing Indigenous sovereignty, right, Indigenous nationhood, as simply a replay of logics of property, right, in ways that seem to me deeply, right, problematic. One can also look at certain anti-Black policies and dynamics, right, historically and currently among some, right, Native folks. So it's not to say that there's no anti-Blackness that can occur among Native people. Of course there is, right? But it's but then understanding Native sovereignty and nationhood and placemaking as sort of inherently an extension of property logic seems to me kind of problematic, especially given that there are these forms of collective placemaking and governance, right, among Black people, historically, currently, everywhere in between, right? And so it's both trying to draw attention to and synthesize and bring together and amplify work in Indigenous studies that thinks about governance, right, at a scale and in a way that's not about state forms, right, or state-like forms, which is also about trying to challenge heteronormative ideologies, right, that understand the nuclear family is just a given. It exists in a private sphere, which is separate from politics, that Native feminist and other work that seeks to rethink what politics is, what political orders are, seeks to challenge, right, that vision of social life, that heteronormative vision of social life. So my work is attempting to bring that together and amplify that, but also think about it in terms of racialization, right? That this also draws attention to and challenges the racialization of Native peoples and the way that racialization has been used to try to shape the form of Indigenous governance, to deny possibilities for Indigenous governance. But amid all of that, then thinking in terms of governance and political orders also becomes a way that are not about state-like forms that take an everyday shape, that also opens up toward other kinds of social forms among other folks, right, including Black folks, right, which wouldn't necessarily be named as governance, but that's one of the reasons why I talk about what I'm doing as a redescription. What does it mean to think about those forms as governance? How does that shift, and this is a term that David Scott uses, shift the problem space in which we think about collective world making and placemaking? And David Scott defines a problem space as an ensemble of questions and answers around which a horizon of identifiable stakes, conceptual as well as ideological political stakes, hangs. So it's rethinking the stakes of something like Black placemaking in order to bring it in order to enable better engagement among forms of placemaking, right, and governance. Even as the question of what does it mean for non-Indigenous folks, right, to be having collective forms of placemaking on Indigenous lands is still an open question. Right? But I think thinking about them as forms of governance and placemaking that are in the context of forms of state racialization, thinking about them having that sort of shared frame, I think can facilitate conversation, even as it doesn't eliminate tensions around non-Indigenous folks on Indigenous lands. Does that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That I'm still trying to make sense of myself as a scholar or academic, and myself as a recovering community organizer. So like I always have both conversations in my mind, and I've been in several conversations in both spheres and where those spheres overlap as well, about this question of or the matter of Black people who are not considered or within the category of indigeneity on these particular lands.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go? Where are we supposed to be? You include a quote here from, is it from Leanne Simpson, where Leanne says, "There's no justice in land back
Mm-hmm.
if it is not in concert with the destruction of racial capitalism, and if Black people remain landless. There is no justice in land back if we are silent with regard to the radical imaginings of Black futures and Black struggles for freedom. Just as there is no justice if Black liberation is framed through the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples." And that is completely an unsettled concept. Like that is not a shared idea, that we can even put Black people in place here in the same conversation. I think it's in Otherwise Worlds, the volume edited by Tiffany King and Andrea Smith, and there's one other person I can't remember right now.
And Mel Navarro?
Maybe is that it? Where
I think maybe.
In the intro, there's some criticism of something that I write about in Unapologetic. And I didn't realize the criticism was there until we read it for class. And I was like, oh, so we're about to talk about we're about to talk about this text in class, and somebody's like, talking about my work, which is, talking about the work is fine, but it's very uncomfortable to be a graduate student and to have your work discussed like that. At least for me, it was. But the point of criticism was around I think it was actually around labor, and how I talked about labor, and I wasn't even well read in Marx to even think about labor in that way, but it was also about the conversation. I think it was a critique around land stewardship and saying that Black people have some claim to land stewardship on this land. And, you know, I, it's a thing that I'm even working out as an organizer. I'm working out in my academic work, and something I'm gonna have to answer in my dissertation, where I sit on it and how I think about it. But what I know for sure, and you talk about this in your text, is property is not the way through the even
Mhm.
like theoretically material, that is not the way through for any of us in understanding land as property, people as property, or hell, anything as property. Which doesn't mean that we can't like have things. It doesn't mean
Mhm.
that we can't live in a place or have a place. But the whole conception of property, whose book is it? Theft is property. I mean, there's several.
Rob Nichols.
Rob Nichols' book, Theft is Property. There's several. I think there's a lot of good thinking out there that lays out why property and is not the way
Mhm.
through or forward, and even like reducing how we understand the relationships of Indigenous peoples to land as property is a problem, and not as a problem. It's just it to me it's ahistorical, and it's just not even real. It's not even based in reality and where we
Mhm.
are right now. And at the same time, as someone, I study Liberia, and I study the development and founding of Liberia, and I also study Black towns in Indian territory, and what became the United States. And I find a mix of how Black people are thinking about land.
Mhm.
There are Black
Mhm.
people who are thinking about land as property, absolutely, as something to be conquered, something to be acquired. And there are Black people who are thinking about land as something, as a placemaking, like a place
Mhm.
of belonging, a place of connection, of cultivation. And I always
Mhm.
go back to, just as much as how I think about governance is about being about how we are with each other on its base level, how we are with each other. It is also like how in the matter of Black people is how are we on the land and how are we with other people on that land? What is our relationship? How do we relate to it? And if we're reproducing practices, logics, all the foolery of US settler colonialism, then to me that is not the way. That's not the way to move. Like what has to be done or what has to be
Mhm.
understood to organize people out of, and what has been done to organize people out of that thinking and that doing. And I think what you're offering here, at least for me, it's helpful to better understand how to think my way through that, and then also how other people are thinking their way through
Mhm.
it and doing through it, which leads me to my last question for now.
Can
Oh,
I speak
please,
to
please. Yes,
that
go ahead.
sort of assemblage of thoughts?
Yeah, go
So, I
ahead.
mean, I think one of the touchstones for me in thinking about the relation between Blackness and placelessness, right, is Catherine McKittrick, right?
Of course.
And she talks about the ways that the racialization of Blackness, particularly in the Americas, right, in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
is that part of the ways that Black people are racialized as Black is in being cast as placeless, right, as
That's
belonging nowhere,
okay.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that one of the crucial ways of challenging forms of anti-Blackness, right, is then envisioning forms of Black place, right? Critically envisioning forms of Black place. So one of the responses to this racialization of Blackness as placelessness has been then a language of fugitivity, of flight, right? But I think also historically, as we've been talking about, that Black people, right, have sought to collectively make place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that also McKittrick thinks about, right? And so to attend to those forms of placemaking seems to me really important. And this is, I quote this in chapter 4, that Cheryl Harris, in thinking about the notion of sovereignty and whether sovereignty is kind of applicable to Black people, she says
Mm-hmm.
that Black people also wanted, in the wake of emancipation, she says, something more than citizenship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just belonging to the nation, just being part of the liberal state, just being included into the liberal state, and thinking about political orders as a way of naming that something more, right?
Mhm.
That's something more for collective place. That's something more for forms of community infrastructure. That's something more of collective decision, right, making. And this is also then part of how I'm rethinking primitive accumulation. So if Coulthard and Nichols and others have rethought it not as something, a moment in the past in the history of
Right.
capitalism, but as the ongoing present situation for Indigenous peoples, that there's also within primitive accumulation the idea of a kind of before and after, right?
Mm.
Shared land before, and then capitalist absorption after, right?
Mm.
And so, but I think we can tweak that a bit, right? Let's say for thinking about Black forms of placemaking. So the before, if we think of before, would be before capture, right? Before enslavement. But
Mm.
instead, if we think not in terms of a historical before and after, right? But instead think about the ways that primitive accumulation, if it's an ongoing process,
Mhm.
then racialization of peoples as criminal, as lacking the ability to have home and family, as lacking the ability to know what proper social forms are, that ongoingly works as a way of breaking up forms of Black placemaking, collectivity, et cetera,
Right.
that don't look like the nuclear family form, right?
Mhm.
And so even though the forms in the wake of emancipation, let's say, may or may not resemble something that was occurring prior to enslavement, right?
Mhm.
But we can still think about primitive accumulation, right? That insertion of people into liberal forms of political economy and the insertion of them as failed, wrong, policed subjects, right? Through the racializing, right, of those groups. We can think about that as a process that ongoingly disrupts possibilities for Black world making and place making, even though there's not an Indigenous before
Mhm.
for Black folks on the lands claimed by the US. But I think that can be a point of articulation. And then for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations to think about how not to contribute to that racializing process of understanding Black people as placeless, right? And Leanne Simpson talks about, when talking about Michi Sagig Nishnabeg forms of diplomacy, her own people's forms of diplomacy,
Mhm.
she says that her people have always had ways of engaging with other people, other peoples, right? And so she envisions a possibility of an engagement with specifically Black people, right,
Mm.
as a diplomatic kind of relation to
Mhm.
share land, right, to be in relation to each other, right,
Mhm.
as communities, as polities, as political orders. And I think that's a very different frame than a kind of property frame. Whose land is this? Even as there's also a recognition that the lands claimed by the US are all Indigenous lands. I think
Mhm.
those things can sit next to each other, even if there are difficult conversations to be had and tensions to be worked through.
Mhm.
And putting tensions to be worked through is like one of the worst euphemisms ever.
Oh yeah, no, I hear you. And it's diplomacy on different terms, and it has to go beyond how people understand nations, how they understand states, because we don't have, if we're looking at the Western notion, or even perhaps like how nations are framed even amongst Indigenous peoples to these lands, as like that is the way you understand and how you have to look at Black people and how you relate to Black people, you're gonna miss a lot there. And then I think furthermore, what if we are considered, as we are, as Indigenous people who've been displaced from
Mhm.
our lands? Like there's an indigeneity that is oftentimes just dropped and erased. I was reading a book once that it's a well-regarded book, and I don't think it wasn't necessarily intentional, but each time Black people were, it was a historical, like a transnational history, and it's more contemporary. I just don't want to name the book because I'm not like trying to slam the book, at least here, in this space. I don't have the time to explain it. But Indigenous people to these lands were referred to as Indigenous and Native people. And not at one point in giving the history of Black people were we ever referred to as Indigenous Africans, even as Africans,
Mhm.
or as Indigenous, at any point we were either referred to as Black or slaves, maybe enslaved, and just the vacating of, and not just erasure, but just even perhaps even a refusal that goes beyond just recognition and like saying a thing, but understanding people as such and what the implications of that there. What can we learn from the mass displacement of various groups of Indigenous peoples? Is that not what people have been looking at for quite some time in Native studies? But that is oftentimes not then translated. And talking about Black people here. And I'm not just even talking about Black people from the transatlantic slave trade, who are brought here through those means, but Black people who have come post Big E emancipation, even thinking about the current migrant crisis. Like, these are Indigenous peoples. If they're coming, like, these are a lot of Indigenous peoples who are coming from the continent of Africa and being displaced for many reasons. What would happen if we thought of people in that way? And it's not to say it would all be good, because there's all great, or it would all be productive or generative or get us, like, move us through collective liberation. But what happens to our thinking when we think about people in that way, and particularly think about Black people that way?
But I guess also one of the things that I wonder, though, is, so certainly it is true that prior to capture, insertion into the transatlantic slave trade, those people and peoples, right, who became Black through that process, right, were Indigenous, right, or were within contemporary terms, we can understand them, right, as Indigenous. But I think there's also the question of, does a thinking about place, does a thinking about collective governance in place need to be routed through indigeneity? Because
No.
then, right, and that's also part of my thinking, because it's
Absolutely.
because then I think that, even though not in what you're saying, but I think in some stagings of that, then that can become a way of bracketing the indigeneity of Indigenous peoples on lands claimed by the U.S. Right?
Absolutely.
And the politics of that incredibly complicated relation of having, for people in the transatlantic slave trade and their descendants, having been forcibly brought to someone else's lands, right? Someone else's lands, who then, then they are conquered, right? And then enslaved people become part of that sort of system in really, really complicated ways, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's not wanting to lose track of Indigenous peoples and nations and their relationship to their, on lands claimed by the US, and their relationship to their lands and waters, right? While at the same time wanting to engage with the presence of other racialized populations whose presence on these lands, right, come through colonialism, warfare, dispossession, right, et cetera, and wanting to think in an expansive way about what governance and placemaking might mean in terms of the relationship among all of these groups, and also noting that there are any number of communities. Wait, it's not as if Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other racialized communities somehow exist in separate, sealed off containers from each other, right? Either, right? So think about a wide range of kinds of political, right, orders, but where being a political order doesn't inherently have to be routed through indigeneity in order to hold on to the political significance of Indigenous peoples on lands claimed by the U.S.
Absolutely. I think that's in service of, I won't say everybody, but that's in service of Indigenous people and in service of Black people who, I should say non-Black, because then there are Indigenous people who are Black Indigenous people, all of it. Like, these are not mutually exclusive things or categories, as you noted. But I think that's in service, like, actually, your relationship to this land as an Indigenous person is not simply because you are Indigenous to the land or your ancestral lands. That's not the only grounds in which, like, people shouldn't be able to come here and do what has been done and what is happening. So
I hate to break up this brilliant.
I see you coming off of Victoria. I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Okay, I hate to break up this brilliant conversation, absolutely, but I did want to give people a chance to to ask some questions from the audience as well. You're also welcome to put a question in the chat. Fred, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much, Mark, for this talk. I actually had the pleasure of assigning chapter 1 of the Politics of Kinship to my seminar on kinship in the anthropology department at UB this term. And the students were all very appreciative of your discussion of how what you call ideologies of enfamilment naturalized forms of social subordination. But I wonder if I could push back at you a bit, though, on your reading of Lewis Henry Morgan, who was one of the founders of kinship studies, as, in effect, an apologist for private property and the nuclear family, which is how you read your argument in chapter 1. It seems to me that Morgan's thought pulls in several different directions, some of which are more interesting than others. As you may know, Marx and Engels were fascinated by Morgan's work, especially his discussion of what he called the law of hospitality and communism and living in his final book, Houses and House Life of the American Aborigines. It's really hard to read that book as any kind of paean to private property or the nuclear family. Morgan was widely claimed as a kind of hero in socialist circles during the 20th century, and I wonder what you make of that. I'm also wondering if you are familiar with the work of the anthropologist Gillian Feely-Harnick, who situates Morgan's kinship studies in terms of his broader interests in the expressivity and intelligence of all beings, including animals and even landscapes. Feely-Harnick shows the very Ojibwe people whom Morgan consulted about his kinship terminology also provided him with key information for his book, The American Beaver and His Works, which appeared a few years before his Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family. In Morgan's view, arrangements of beaver lodges and dams have a semantic logic that parallels the semantics of kinship terms, and he saw both as reflecting the intelligence of all life forms. So I wonder how you'd respond to those.
So I think that a lot of people have done a lot of things with Lewis Henry Morgan, right? So it's not as if his the genealogies can be traced back to him are all of a piece, right? So one thing that I say in the chapter is that Lewis Henry Morgan is a way of trying to get a handle on what seems to me a lot of the work that the kinship concept performs, right? And performs both in terms of scholarship, but also just in everyday ways that we use it. And it seems to me that, as I argue in the chapter, that Morgan takes political systems and takes social systems, right, whose coordinates don't either look at all like Euro-American social life, but also social systems and political systems that don't necessarily look at all like each other, and translates them into a shared vocabulary and intellectual framework in which kinship, as a concept, works as a way of trying to think about the relationship between what we might call social reproduction and governance, right? But does so in a way that understands what he's seeing through the prism of the nuclear family form, right? So even though he may or may not at various times endorse the nuclear family form and private property as the best social form, although certainly in ancient society, he does cast it as the end of the, at least I was gonna say the end of the evolutionary line, or at least the most evolved, right, form that humanity has reached yet, which I think has deeply racializing implications for thinking about other peoples. But I think it's that translation of other social forms into what seems to me the framework, right, of the nuclear family. His frame of reference for understanding what he's seeing is the nuclear family, and so that social forms where social reproduction and governance are mixed, he reads as a kind of distended, fictive, right, version of real kinship, which is the nuclear family, right, which is the base, right, for what he's saying. And there, I mean, there's also, so like Marshall Sahlins, right, in talking about kinship, has tried to think about it as a kind of a capacity for care, right, and support. And so it's, you know, part of what I run into in thinking about Morgan, thinking about kinship, is in some ways, all terms, all concepts that we use serve as a translational matrix, right? You look at stuff that you see in the world, and then you put it in terms of the concept. But what I'm trying to, so it's something like what Morgan is talking about in terms of kinship, right? And this as a transcultural, transhistorical way of talking about human social relations, right? There are various ways of trying to talk about forms of care, you had said, Fred, the expressivity and intelligence of all, right, beings. But I think what particularly is of interest to me is the way that efforts to talk about social forms that aren't liberal political economy, that aren't the separation of the public and private sphere, that aren't modeled on the nuclear family, and that those efforts to talk about those social forms get put into the conceptual and political orbit of the nuclear family in ways that limit a capacity to talk about other forms of governance, right? Other political orders. And that's what I'm trying to underline, even though certainly with Lewis Henry Morgan, I mean, Lewis Henry Morgan certainly is a bad guy in my account, and to put it in kind of a reductive way. And there are other stories that one could tell about Lewis Henry Morgan, but that's the kind of function he serves to try to ground that way of talking about kinship, our sort of everyday ways of talking about kinship, to provide a kind of instance through which to think through what that seems to me to entail in terms of ideas about governance, social forms, and race. But it's not surprising to me that that account and that explanation might not be wholly satisfactory to an anthropologist.
Thank you, Fred, and Mark, for your reply as well. Other questions? I'll weigh in if nobody else is. I'll put my historian hat on here for a moment, and more sort of lived experience. And I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about this link you're making between Black studies and Indigenous studies in terms of kind of historical work. And I know that the term collective placemaking has been used a lot. But some of that collective placemaking isn't so collective, and is based on sort of on normative models of particularly the breadwinner family, right? The sort of 20th century model, liberal model, thinking here of the historian Robert Self, who writes about this pretty extensively, about breadwinner liberalism and breadwinner conservatism as a kind of normative family model, and how that enters into political culture. But places like Mount Bayou, Mississippi, for example, all Black town in Mississippi, is based in part on kind of patriarchal nuclear family norms and Booker T. Washington's ideology. So it's more complicated than a simply kind of resistance. And so I'm wondering just for your response to that, but also, and because I'm less familiar with the Indigenous cases, right, how the differences. So there's obviously connections you want to make, and I think that's incredibly generative and powerful. And Charlene, you as well, really, really interesting. But also, what are some of the differences historically in this process?
I mean, and this is as Charlene was saying, that in her own work on thinking about the formation of Black towns in Oklahoma, and then also Black migrants, right, to Liberia, right, that it's not as if no one ever had ideas of property, right, or heteropatriarchal notions, right, of family. But it's, and it's also one of the things that I note in my discussion of, let's say, what seem to me forms of Black political orders in the wake of emancipation. It's not as if there weren't instances of sexism or sexual violence, right? And so it's not about innocence, it's not about purity, and it's not about really even a vision of resistance, right? Because it's not. When I talk about these political orders, it's not to say that, oh, all of them are inherently desirable. All of them are inherently models, right? It's instead to say, this is a way of opening up ideas about what can constitute governance, right? In ways that move away from the ideas of the liberal state, of the nuclear, right, family model, and that historically there are instances of people trying to work this through in ways that I think are irreducible to the sort of liberal notion of municipal governance over, right, the private sphere understood in de facto nuclear family, right, terms and as separable, right, households. And so I think one of the big differences is that there are between Black and Indigenous, right, histories, formulations, right, there are legally recognized Native nations, Indigenous nations, right, on lands claimed by the US and Canada, right? There are Native national governments, right, which have constitutions, which have administrative structures, right? And it's not to set that aside. It's not to present that as somehow less authentic, right? It's to say that there are among Native, particularly Native feminists, but a range of Native scholars and intellectuals, ways of thinking about the everydayness, right? And this is Laura Harjo refers to it, Skokie scholar named Laura Harjo refers to it as vernacular sovereignties, right? Forms of everyday interaction which constitute the basis for peoplehood, separate from, as she talks about it, the formalities of the state form, right? But there are legally and politically visible forms of Indigenous governance, right? There are also other forms of Indigenous governance that aren't legally and politically visible, including peoples who aren't legally recognized, including social forms that don't look like the institutional form of Native, right, nationhood. But I think that's a huge basis of a difference that there aren't, other than something like Black towns, right? There really isn't a form of kind of separate, distinct Black governance on land that is recognized, right? And I think part of my aim is to, because that seems like, and this is part of what leads to some scholars talking about Native nationhood and Native nations' jurisdiction over their territories as just property, right? Because, well, there isn't that kind of recognition, right, for a Black presence, Black histories, right? So this is just another version of state notions, right, of state-endorsed notions of property. And so it's to try to break down that distinction to create a possibility of other ways of speaking that can recognize those forms of governance that aren't visible in their recognition by the state. Even while at the same time not setting aside or trying to minimize the importance of Native nations, Native tribal governments, right, on lands claimed by the U.S., their exertion of sovereignty and jurisdiction, right, over their territories. It's not to again diminish that or push that aside, but it's also to open up something beside it, right? I think the notion of beside does a lot of conceptual work for me that I could also talk more about.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for that answer. And I want to give Charlene a chance to weigh in again, but any other questions that people have? Charlene, did you want to respond either to either answers that Mark gave?
For sure. I mean, the example of Mound Bayou is really interesting, and it made me think about one of the founders of Mound Bayou, Isaiah Montgomery.
Right.
His initial, at least a part of his initial vision for Mound Bayou is for it to be like an egalitarian agrarian society, where class was not a determinant for like people's status in society. Now, how that played out and what actually played out could be a very different thing. I think largely what Mark is saying, and the examples that he's given in this talk and also in the text, is like encouraging us to look other places for politics and other places for governance. And outside of what is oftentimes considered the big P politics, I mean, Kathy Cohen, as she's talking about like where Black politics happens. And even Mark, I forgot I wrote those things about governance. Thank you. I'm going to put those in my dissertation. I'm like, oh, I did say some things about governance before. But looking in other places to identify where people are relating to each other and making decisions together. If we only are looking for the big P politics or the state or the nation state or the nation, then we're going to miss a lot about how people already are together. And in turns, as we are theorizing and even taking up our historical projects, we can actually take up, I think, more holistic historical projects or historical research where we're looking in the archives, what we're looking for. For example, in Bowley, I look at how they made decisions around how to deal with conflict, violence, and harm as a site of governance. So I'm thinking about, did they have marshals? Did they have policing? How did they deal with violence? Now, if I'm only looking for, did they have a mayor? Did they have a city council? Did they vote? All of those things, then I'm going to miss a lot about how governance is happening. Even if I'm only looking at civic and religious institutions, I'm going to miss a lot about what's actually happening in these places. And in the instance of Liberia, I think it's a potent example of where it is what Sylvester Johnson calls a Black Christian settler nation, one in which that was initially founded by land acquired by white men who were agents of the U.S. government and the American Colonization Society. It was in more than one way eventually a nation that was governed by and for Black people from the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I really mean the Americas. That includes Black people from Barbados and other parts of the Americas who were a part of building Liberia. And so I think in the very conservative field of history, we can oftentimes just look at particular things in the archives to give us a signal as to how governance is happening and where it's happening, and we can look other places. And if there are no other questions, I did have a question for Mark that was related to his citation practice.
That's perfect. That final question goes to Charlene. Go.
Okay, great. It's a question about your citation and your reading practices. So you are drawing upon several fields in this text. I mean, and across your work. And I would love it if you could talk about that, like for folks who are either in the middle of projects or have done projects or interested in developing projects that have this sort of breadth and depth. How did you go about it? And yeah, citationally and through your reading practice.
So before that, just want to come back a little bit to Victoria's question and picking up, Charlene, on what you were saying about historiographic work. So like part of my thinking about post-emancipation life for Black people in the South, right, was also that historiographically, what gave rise to things like union leagues and churches and whatever often gets just sort of described as kinship. And it's this precursor thing, right, to what really matters, which is the institutions, right? And it's what happens if we redescribe that, if we think about the forms that are getting labeled as kinship as actually doing the work of governance, right? They also generate these institutions that can engage with the state and can do other kinds of organizing. But what happens if we think about differently about those things that are showing up, right, in the archive in the ways that Charlene was talking about? Okay, citation. So I really think, I mean, maybe I think about this as a kind of literary scholar because that's my training, but I think about reading scholarship and bodies of scholarship as in some ways reading for the plot, right? When I'm writing about something, right? And I'm trying to read scholarship around it, I'm not just looking for like one person's take on, I'm trying to figure out like what seems to be the thing that everyone talks about, what seems to be the things that people come back to, what seem to be the principles organizing how this conversation, scholarly conversation about, post-emancipation life in the South, or about, Native feminist rereadings of Indigenous governance. Like, what are the things that seem to be shared, right? And to use that as a base, right? And it's also that then part of my reading practice is to make sure I understand, or try to understand, in the various, if I'm engaging in a range of different conversations, right? And I'm trying to be mindful of what conversations both I'm trying to engage in, but also given the materials that I'm talking about and the questions I'm talking about, what conversations, already existing scholarly conversations, do I really need to be aware of, right? In order to responsibly engage in this, in order to not pretend that I'm the first person talking about, right, X, right? And so then it's reading enough so that then I feel like I have a sense, okay, here's what people keep coming back to. Here, the incidents or the scholars or the concepts or the ways of framing. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense of how that conversation works. And then I can engage meaningfully, right, in relation to it. And so that's why it seemed to me, I mean, in some ways, I'm deeply old school in this way, and this also has to do with like other quirks of my personality, which have nothing to do with being a scholar. But it's the sort of reading in really broad ways. So I feel like I have a base, right, from which to say things, right? That seems to me crucial, that if I don't really have a sense of these conversations into which I'm entering, I really can't say anything meaningful. And so it really, and I think about it as not, I'm intervening in some way, but it's like I'm contributing to already existing conversations and hopefully in ways that help them move forward, and thinking about what it means to engage in ways that help move these conversations forward, which also means that I need to illustrate that I've listened. I need to illustrate that I've heard, right? That I've been paying attention in these conversations. Otherwise, why should anyone listen to me?
Well, I can say that you're definitely moving the conversation forward in powerful ways, as are you, Charlene. So I'm certainly indebted to both of you for joining us today. And let's give everybody a round of applause.